Hello. Hello. Good afternoon.
Game na, Miss Rose.
Okay. Hello. Good afternoon. And welcome to another edition of our live stream, discussing about critical human rights issues in the Philippines. And of course, our human rights concerns is not only here, but all around the world. So this afternoon, we're very happy that our discussion would be centering on the issues of death penalty and drugs. No, we know that in the Philippines there is now a call for a imposition of death penalty, and they would like this death penalty to be in place for drug offenders. They were saying the big drug offenders or drug lords. So this afternoon, we are privileged and we are very honored to have our experts, not only from Asia, but also around the world. An Italian, a Malaysian experts on human rights and drugs issues, and of course our own Philippine experts from NoBox Philippines. And we are also happy that Attorney Kathy would be helping us to moderate this event. This live stream is co-sponsored with NoBox Philippines, which is the prime NGO who is helping us out on our concerns on providing a better understanding of the drug issues in the Philippines, that it's not an issue only that relates to crime, but especially an issue that relates to public health concerns. And we are very, of course, very concerned that these concerns on drugs will be used as justification for the imposition of the drug penalty. So as we continue, I would like to turn over to Attorney Kathy, our moderator for this afternoon. Attorney Kathy?
Good afternoon. Magandang hapon. Salamat Ate Rose sa pagpapakilala. Salamat. Thank you. Like Ate Rose, I'm also I feel very fortunate that we are joined today by our colleagues who have been working in the field of drug policy and have also had extensive experience in dealing with the situation of having the death penalty in their countries. But I'd like for you to meet them, and I'd like to invite them to introduce themselves. So may I invite Giada to please tell us a little bit about the work that you do and yourself, please.
Hi everyone, and thanks for having me today. So my name is Giada. I'm a human rights analyst at Harm Reduction International. Harm Reduction International is a London-based NGO working to reduce the negative health, social, and legal impacts of drug use and drug policies. And we do that through research and advocacy. As part of our work towards health-centered evidence-based drug policies, we monitor human rights abuses committed in the name of drug control and advocate for the rights of people who use drugs and their communities. For over 10 years now, we've been working on the death penalty for drug offenses and doing research and advocacy towards its abolition. We're the leading international organization working on this specific topic. And beyond monitoring death sentences and executions that happen around the world, we also analyze specific issues such as public opinion on the death penalty for drugs or its disproportionate impact on those most vulnerable and marginalized, so populations such as women and foreign nationals. So thanks again for having me, and I look forward to the conversation today.
Thank you, Giada. Looking forward to more of your sharing later. Now may I ask Ricky to please introduce yourself?
Hello, everyone. My name is Ricky Gunawan. I'm a human rights lawyer and academic. I'm a co-founder and former director of LBHM, or Community Legal Aid Institute, based in Jakarta, Indonesia, where we are a frontline legal aid organizations that advocates for abolitions of the death penalty and drug policy reform. I myself have been practicing for around 12 years or so, defending death row prisoners, including people who facing executions for drug convictions. I assisted Rodrigo Goularte, a Brazilian national who was executed in 2015, and Humphrey Ejike Jefferson, a Nigerian national who was also executed in Indonesia, July 2016. Thank you for having me and look forward for our conversations.
Thank you, Ricky. And now from the Philippines, I'd like to invite Inez to please introduce herself.
Hi there. Hello, good afternoon. So my name is Inez from NoBox, and siguro just NoBox Philippines. So just a quick introduction. NoBox Philippines was basically set up because we felt that it was time to bring sense and humanity into the way we understand, and therefore the way we respond to issues related to drugs. So we advocate for responses that would be policies, programs, services that advocate for prioritize the health, the safety, and well-being. So we do research, technical assistance, and basically just changing the conversation around drugs. So thank you very much again.
Attorney Kathy? Yeah, maybe we can hear from Attorney Lee.
Magandang hapon po. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Edson P. Yarcia. I work with Inez in NoBox Philippines. So in NoBox Philippines, we've been working and we've been doing advocacy efforts to build a more inclusive society for everyone, including people who use drugs. We've been working on different initiatives so that we can create a society that is rights-based, that is consistent with the lived experience of people in communities, one that is humane and one that is compassionate. With NoBox Philippines, I've been working on drug policy reform and also on research. So we've done a lot of studies in relation to people who use drugs and what are the proper responses, the evidence-based responses, the humane responses that will work. And that should entail moving away from an environment of punishment and moving towards one that is consistent with the right to health and the right of everyone to life.
Okay, salamat po. Thank you very much. Attorney Kathy, are you here?
Yes, I'm back. Sorry, I got disconnected, but okay. Lee, I'm just going to reconnect the video in a while, but can I also ask you to please tell us a little bit about the history of drug prohibition, like how it started and what's happening? How did we end up with all of these policies that we have now? Please, Lee. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kathy. I think it's very important for us to begin this conversation on death penalty with understanding the framework of drug prohibition in the Philippines. You know, if you listen to the news reports, if you listen to the arguments being raised by the proponents of death penalty, the main argument really is to say that death penalty is needed as an important drug policy tool so that people will not use drugs, so that the drug lords will not sell drugs anymore, so that the communities will be safer and it will be a drug-free society. So I think it's important for us to analyze and unpack these arguments, this perspective on drug prohibition. And as Kathy mentioned, I think it might be good for us to revisit first. What's the history of drug prohibition in the Philippines? What has been the experience of the Philippines in terms of legislating or introducing interventions for drugs, and have they worked in the past? Okay? So let me just run through briefly, no? When we talk about drugs or substances in the Philippines, we go way back to early pre-colonial Philippines. You know, at that time, substances such as alcohol, such as areca nut. I'm sure you've heard of this practice in the communities in the provinces wherein they chew the areca nut. They call it nganga. Diba? These have psychoactive effects. No? And in early Philippines, when you talk about substance, when you talk about psychoactive substances such as alcohol and areca nut, they're not prohibited. They're actually an integral aspect of our culture. And even when the Spaniards and the Americans came, the practice, indigenous practice of chewing psychoactive substances, consuming psychoactive substances, it was there. Okay? The first actual prohibition that we experienced is in relation to opium. So when the Spaniards started regulating opium use, there's a dichotomous policy. So for the Chinese, it's okay to consume opium in opium dens. Okay, but for Filipinos, it became criminalized. So for Filipinos, it's not allowed to consume opium, and but for the Chinese, where the practice is common, that's allowed to them. So when the Americans came, initially they adopted this dichotomous policy, but the Americans started what they call the American narco diplomacy. And because we're a colony of the United States, we adopted that. What's the narco diplomacy? With the US narco diplomacy, it's a total ban on non-medical use of opium. That's the first prohibition. Huh? And then there were penalties for that, fines, imprisonment for individuals who would use drugs, opium, and also for individuals who would trade or sell drugs. And in the years to follow, you would see that it became it became stricter and stricter. There were drug treaties under the aegis, the leadership, of course, of the under the American narco diplomacy. The schedule of prohibited drugs, they were expanded. So artificial drugs that were created, they were included. And in the Philippines, at the time of the dictator President Marcos, when we adopted a comprehensive ban on prohibition on substances, we also included the penalty of death. Okay, the Philippines actually had an experience of executing a quote unquote drug lord at that time, and we've been arresting more people, and then we've been putting more people in jail for substance use. The most recent drug policy regime that we have in the Philippines is RA 9165, and you're all very familiar with it. But with RA 9165, we became a more punitive society. We created this idea of a person who used drugs that is the source of all crime-related issues. And so when you try to evaluate the present perspective of the government right now, reintroducing death penalty, because during the time of Gloria Macapagal Arroyo, we suspended that death penalty. But right now, there's a discussion to bring it back, as if the war on drugs, the recent experience of the Philippines on war on drugs, which is a more deadly crackdown for people who use drugs, as if that's not sufficient as a means to create a society that is free of drugs. Okay, so that's our experience, no, from the pre-colonial time until the present time. We can observe three things there. It's increasingly punitive, so it's becoming harsher and harsher. But if you compare that with the reaction in communities, people still use drugs, even at the risk of dying. We've heard a lot of talkhouse stories. 30,000 people have died on war on drugs, but we see people still use drugs. No? It's becoming more moralized. The issue on addiction, the issue on perceiving people who use drugs as addicts and with moral infirmity. So they're being demonized. No? So if you look at the way our experience with drugs is coming along, it's becoming more punitive, it's becoming more demonized, and it's becoming more deadly. And I think, Kathy, it's important for us to have a discussion right now. Will it be death penalty? Should it be an additional tool? Or maybe is there something wrong with the way we're approaching drug policy? And I think this is an important avenue for us to have a discussion on that. So I guess that's a brief summary of our history on drug prohibition, and I'll turn the platform back to Kathy and to the rest of the resource speakers.
Thank you, Lee. Thank you for that very comprehensive discussion of how our drug policies have evolved through the years. And also, yes, it's true. I agree with you completely that it's important to rethink the questions that we're asking ourselves as far as drugs and punishment is concerned. It's really good to think about all of these things, and so we have this opportunity now to also talk to advocates with experiences from other countries where the death penalty is being enforced. So I hope we make the most of this time to talk about these questions that you just posed also. Would anyone else want to share about why we need to have this conversation now, or shall we proceed to the video break? All right, I'll take that as as a yes. Let's proceed to the next video from Para and iDEFEND.
Letter G57, bilangin ang inyong kartong itinaniman number 6. Tuloy tayo bilang karta na po. Itinaniman number 6. Tuloy tayo bilang karta na po.
At nababalita na naman at nalalathala kung saan araw ng mga karapatang pantao. Kay sarap sa tenga pakinggan, dapat lang napahalagahan. Ngunit magkakano nga ba ang karapatang pantao? Di nga makabayad ng kuryente, halos di walang ang pamasahe. Ang kumakalam na mga tiyan, di nga masidlan. Yun pa kaya pambili ng karapatang pantao? Sorry ka na lang kung ika'y walang pambili ng karapatang pantao. Basta ka na lang na napapaslang. Sa lumulubha na kalagyan ay lumilikha ng paraan upang ang dukha ay magawang magpakatao. Napag-uusapan na rin lang paano ang dangal depensahan, ipaglaban at akuin ang karapatang pantao. Di nga makahanap ng trabaho at napapahamak pa sa bisyo. Nagkanda baon na sa utang, saan mo pa ngayon kukunin ang pambili ng karapatang pantao? Luhod ng ilang, may puhunan lang, pambili ng karapatang pantao. Sa bansang walang kasarilan, nilubos-lubos na ng iba, sampalataya sa buo nila. At ang himala na napala ay palala ng palala. Yari nga ba sa puneraryang patay nila? At walang-wala ang pambili ng karapatang pantao. Sorry ka na lang kung ika'y walang pambili ng karapatang pantao. Basta ka na lang na napapaslang. Pambili ng karapatang pantao. pera lang.
Talaga naman, love is not completed without sex. Letter B, will parating ang number 6.
Hello, Kathy.
Hello po.
Yes, ma'am, please proceed.
All right, thank you. Thank you. Sorry. I would like to also invite our colleagues, our friends from other countries who are here today to please share about your experience with how the death penalty is being enforced in your own country, or in your experience with working in other countries um, where there's very punitive drug policies as well. Can I invite Giada to please share?
Thanks. So I think I'll give you maybe a global perspective to give a sense of what's happening everywhere around the world with the death penalty for drugs. So there are 35 countries today where the death penalty for drugs is on their books. However, many of these countries do not really enforce this measure. In 2019, so last year, HRI recorded death sentences for drug offenses in 13 countries and executions only in 4 countries, Iran, Saudi Arabia, China, and Singapore. We believe executions also happened in Vietnam, but because of state secrecy, we weren't able to confirm this information. And by the way, this lack of transparency by the retentionist country on their use of the death penalty is something that's actually quite common, and that's problematic because it makes hard for us to really monitor what's happening. There are at least 3,000 people sitting on death row for a drug crime today, although we believe the actual number is likely to be much, much higher. Again, last year, we had around 120 executions for drug offenses. And again, this figure does not include executions from China. China is believed to be the top executioner, both for the death penalty generally and for drug offenses. However, again, a state secret is in place in China on the use of capital punishment, so we don't know exactly how many people were executed for drugs. So as you can see, the countries retaining the death penalty for drugs are really just a tiny and isolated minority, signaling that the practice does not really have a lot of international legitimacy and support. I think it's also worth mentioning that there are some groups of people that are disproportionately impacted by the death penalty for drug offenses, and that's something that we tend to see in all the retentionist countries, most notably women and foreign nationals. Just to give you one example, in Malaysia at the end of 2019, there were 1,289 people on death row. Of these, according to Amnesty International, roughly 70% were awaiting execution for drug trafficking. Of these 1,289, only 141 were women. However, of these 141, an overwhelming 95% had been sentenced to death for drug offenses, and 90% were foreign nationals. Another thing that we see in a lot of places where the death penalty for drugs is in place is that death sentences are imposed after processes that cannot be defined as fair and just under international law. So we keep seeing violations of fair trial rights. We've seen again and again that sentences being imposed at the end of law trials, for example, where the defendant didn't have access to an effective lawyer from the early stages of arrest and investigation. They were not given interpreters, their clemency petitions were ignored, or the death penalty was imposed as a mandatory punishment, so preventing judges from considering all the circumstances of the case. So I think this is the international, where we are at the international level. And if you have any question, I'm happy to answer them.
Okay, Kathy? Kathy? Okay. Thank you, Giada, for that overview, no, of the problem on drug offenders being on the death penalty. And I'm sure, we hope that the Philippines would not get to that status again, no, of being in the list of countries who will be using death penalty against drug offenses. And maybe we can also ask, no, how about in Asia region? And I'm sure Attorney Ricky can provide us some more insights in Asia or in Indonesia, especially so that we have this one case, no, of our overseas Filipino worker who is on death penalty in Indonesia, and I think it was the Indonesians who really pursued a campaign against the drug penalty for this Filipina. Ricky?
Thank you, Rose. Giada has provided an excellent introduction on overview of death penalty for drug offenses. So let me take you to zoom in into a country level experience, and that is Indonesia. Indonesia has death penalty for a wide range of crimes, but mainly imposed for premeditated murder, drug offenses, and terrorism. And at the moment, we have around maybe 200 people on death row, and roughly half of it are for drug offenses, and half of those on death row for drug are foreign nationals. Now, in the past 12 years or so, I've been taking up a lot of death penalty cases, mostly murders, because some lawyers, some criminal defense lawyers, some human rights lawyers are even allergic to drugs cases. So what I can say in almost all cases that I assist, no one got proper legal defense. Torture is common, and for foreign nationals, they never got adequate interpreter. So unfair trial is a norm rather than an exception. Now, I can say, for example, two standout cases, which I also assisted in a few years. Rodrigo Gularte, a Brazilian national, he had schizophrenia and bipolar disorder. And he was executed in April 2015, despite that we could prove, and we have a long list of medical records that could show that Rodrigo had serious mental illness. Even from the head of prison also confirmed that Rodrigo had mental health problems. And so on the very last minutes of his executions, we continued to fight to divert him from executions to mental health facility. But then he was executed anyway. He was executed in April 2015 in the same batch where Mary Jane Veloso, a Filipino woman who was listed for executions, but was postponed in the very last minute. Now, Rodrigo, when he was about to be executed, he was not aware that he was about to be executed. So when he was taken out from his cell into the execution site, he couldn't understand what was happening. And so
Attorney Ricky? I think we have some connection problem. Well, I hope when he gets back, it's very interesting what he's saying about these two cases, especially our own case of Mary Jane Veloso. Ricky, are you back?
yeah, I'm back. I'm sorry, I got.
It's okay.
Yeah.
Please continue.
Yeah, so I was saying about Rodrigo's case, which is in the same batch with Mary Jane Veloso. So I got the chance to meet with Mary Jane and her families during that time. And the second case that I would like to quickly raise is the case of Humphrey Jefferson, a Nigerian national. He owned an African restaurant in Jakarta, and he was tortured to confess drugs that was found by the police in his restaurant. But of course, he never admitted because he never stayed in this restaurant, and the police forced him to confess. And because he couldn't bear the torture, so he admitted that he hid the drugs inside the restaurant. Now, in the court hearing, his English was not very good. His Indonesian was not very good as well. So he never got properly interpreter as well as lawyers. And in one of the considerations of the judges was saying that so Jeff is a single defendant in his case. So there's no co-defendant, although the charge was drug trafficking. So the judges put this one line saying that because he's a black-skinned Nigerian national, and Nigerian national usually doing drug dealings, and therefore Jeff is also drug dealing. So this is the typical stereotype of African nationals in Indonesia when it comes to drug offenses. So again, this just a summary of cases where in almost all death penalty cases in Indonesia, there are flaws, both in procedures and in substance. A lot of people are fabricated, and they never got proper legal defense. And final thing that I would like to say is that even we have death penalty since many years ago, it never decreased drug offenses. It never curbed drug offenses. The drug rates continues to increase every year. And even it is also admitted by the National Narcotics Board, by the police, by the government, but they continue to impose that sentence. Simply because it's the easiest political tool when they want to use to show to the public that they are tough on crime, tough on drugs. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ricky. Thank you also, Giada. I feel very worried listening to the stories that you were sharing because I see so many similarities with the situation of the criminal justice system in the Philippines, where we have, for example, our public defenders, our public attorney's office who are handling the defense of indigent accused who cannot afford to pay for private lawyers. They're already overwhelmed with the number of cases because of the war on drugs. And for example, in the city that I live in, an average each public attorney has an average of about 600 cases to handle. So with the rate that our criminal justice system is going, with the volume of the number of cases that they have to attend to, I cannot imagine how a proper defense can really be prepared, and how much time they're able to spend to really provide, assistance to their clients. And I've spoken with some of them, and they themselves have shared that it's really problematic that sometimes they only get to meet their clients during the hearing, the court hearing, and this is only for a few minutes because they have to rush to another hearing. So if a person's life is at stake, what kind of legal service can this person expect, considering the situation in our justice system now? And so I'd also like to ask Lee and Inez to please share how do you see the Philippines responding to what's happening all over the world with the death penalty. Would you like to start first, Inez? Inez, can you hear me?
Can I
Go ahead,
please
please.
can you hear me? Is okay?
Yes, go ahead, Inez.
No, I was just saying, even the fact that we're here talking about this and that it's an issue that we're talking about, because if you think about when we trying to sit down and talk about policies and designing programs and services, the whole idea is because we want to promote health, safety, and welfare. So it really seems inane if you think about it that we are actually talking about killing people and getting rid of sacrificing lives. So the conversation has been more. We've been having more conversations in the past few years about drugs. So I think that's good that there is recognition that there are a lot of other issues that need to be addressed, socioeconomic issues. And I think a lot of the things that we're doing right now is more of band-aid solutions, very, very reactive. Um, for example, if you're talking about, there is recognition, for example, even among proponents of the death penalty, where people are getting involved because of systemic corruption, because of poverty, because of imperfect criminal justice system. So if there is recognition for that, then I think we already then know what we're supposed to address. It doesn't really make sense why we will allow people we've chosen we've decided were disposable to let them pay for the failure of the system with their lives. So yeah, so I think Lee, if you wanna add on to that, but I think that's just very, very basic. There are things that we can already do that doesn't have to entail sacrificing lives. Lee, I think it's mute.
You're muted, Lee.
Sorry. Yes, I agree with Inez, no, and also with the previous discussions. If you look at how the world is evolving or developing, we've been moving away from punitive measures, and actually we've been moving away from death penalty. If you look at the statistics for different states, around 106 abolished death penalty already by law, and around 142 countries have abolished it in law and in practice. So the progression from the creation of the human rights treaties that we had from the 1940s until the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the optional protocol on the abolition of death penalty, we're moving towards that area wherein we're protecting the right to life more. We're protecting the right to health. And we're recognizing that it's a blind approach to look at criminal issue merely from the lens of punishment. But it's really trying to unpack the reasons why people use drugs and what are the different factors surrounding issues such as crimes. And I think at this point, if you look at the conversations from the proponents of the death penalty, what is glaringly absent is that discussion, nuanced discussion on the different factors surrounding drug use. And I think that's very important because without looking into the social and economic drivers and the actual issues that are relevant to communities in relation to drugs, then we are just adding more harmful policies that are related to prohibition. And I think that's a way, a step backwards, from a society that has been evolving and has been developing and is becoming more rights-based.
Thank you, Lee. Thank you, Inez, for those insights. Before we proceed to the next part of our discussion, may I invite all of us to watch this video from the Flag Anti-Death Penalty Task Force.
Ang pagpatay ng kriminal ay matagal nang sinasabi na pinaka-epektibong paraan para maudlot ang krimen. Ang parusang bitay ay dati nang ipinawalang bisa sa Pilipinas noong 2006. Ayon sa data ng Philippine National Police, noong panahon na pinapatupad ang parusang bitay, tumaas ang insidente ng rape at murder mula 1996 hanggang 2006. Tumaas din ng 274% ang itinalang mga kaso ng rape noong 1998 hanggang 2000, mga taong na may inexecute na bilanggo. Nang ipinawalang bisa ang parusang bitay, bumaba ang volume ng krimen sa Pilipinas. Ayon sa data ng Philippine National Police at Philippine Statistics Authority, pababa ng pababa ang bilang ng krimen mula 2009 hanggang 2015. May 6 na panukalang batas ngayon sa Kamara at sa Senado na gustong ibalik ang parusang bitay. Sa ilalim ng 6 na panukalang batas, mayroong 63 na krimen na ang parusa ay kamatayan. Sa 63 na krimen, 34 ay may mandatory death sentences. At 29 ay maaaring mahatulan ng death sentence. Kung maipasa ang panukalang batas ng Senado at Kongreso, ang paraan ng parusang pitay ay lethal injection, hanging at firing squad. Kailangan nating tutulan ang parusang bitay bills sa Senado at Congress. Ito ay lumalabag sa karapatan nating lahat na mabuhay. Ayon sa Philippine Supreme Court, 71.77% ng mga sentensyang may parusang bitay na hinatulan ng korte ay maling ipinataw. Ang ibig sabihin nito, 7 sa 10 preso sa death row ay maling nahatulan ng kamatayan kahit na inosente sila. Ang parusang bitay ay brutal, makasadista at hindi makatao. Kung binitay ang preso, maaaring aabot na hanggang 45 minuto bago siya mamatay. Kung sa firing squad, pag hindi tinamaan ng puso, posibleng matagal bago mamatay ang preso dahil sa kawalan ng dugo. Ang lethal injection ay may mataas na rate of failure. May mga pagkakataon na hindi namamatay ang preso. Hindi konstitusyonal ang parusang bitay. Ang 6 na panukalang batas ay hindi sumusunod sa 2 rekisito ng compelling reason at heinous crime ng 1987 Constitution. Walang compelling reason na ibalik ang parusang bitay dahil patuloy na bumababa ang krimen sa bansa. Walang pamantayan ang mga panukalang batas sa paglarawan ng heinous crime. Kailan magiging heinous ang isang krimen? Labag sa pandaigdigang batas ang parusang bitay. Niratipika ng Pilipinas ang International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights noong 1986 at ang Second Optional Protocol to the ICCPR nang walang alinlangan o without reservations noong 2007. Sa ilalim ng Article 1 ng Protocol, bawal na i-execute ng Pilipinas ang sino mang tao sa loob ng kanyang jurisdiksyon at kailangan niyang gawin ang lahat para mawala ang parusang bitay. Hindi maaaring bawiin ng Pilipinas ang pagpirma niya sa protocol o pagsali niya sa ICCPR. Mula 2007, dumami ang mga bansang bumoto para sa pagtutol ng parusang bitay. Inaprubahan ng Pilipinas ang mga resolusyon noong 2007, 2008, 2010, 2012 at 2014. Ang Pilipinas mismo ang co-sponsor ng resolusyon noong 2012. Hindi makakapigil ng krimen ang parusang bitay. Noong 2008, may isang pag-aaral sa US na nagpakita na hindi bumababa ang krimen kapag may parusang bitay. Bumababa ang bilang ng krimen sa Pilipinas simula nang mawala ang parusang bitay. Ang madalas na tinatamaan ng parusang bitay ay ang mahihirap. Ayon sa survey ng mga preso noong 2004 ng Free Legal Assistance Group, ang pinakamataas na natapos na mga bilanggo ay elementarya. 81.8% ng preso ay nagtatrabaho bilang informal workers. Hindi susugpuin ng parusang bitay ang problema ng droga sa Pilipinas. Ang dapat na layunin ng ating patakaran sa droga ay masiguradong matulungan ang mga taong adik na malayo sa droga. Ang kasalukuyan nating batas ay hindi tumitingin sa antas ng paglahok ng isang tao sa droga. Kahit sinong may hawak o nagbenta o gumawa ng droga ay pwedeng maparusahan ng parusang bitay. May nakitang pagbaba sa paggamit sa droga, sakit na kaugnay sa droga at krimen sa mga bansang nagpalit pananaw tungkol sa problema ng droga. Mula krimen, ginawa nilang isyung pangkalusugan at social service-oriented ang droga. Tinatago ng parusang bitay ang totoong dahilan ng krimen. Ito ay isang simplistic na solusyon sa problema ng krimen. Ang dapat na layunin ng criminal justice system ay ang pagpapanumbalik o pagbabago ng mga taong nagkasala. May mga pag-aaral na pinapakita na ang hinahanap ng mga biktima ay pagkabuo, hindi paghihiganti. Ang sistema na nagbibigay daan sa mga biktima para harapin ang may sala para hanapin ang pagbabayad pinsala ay posibleng magbigay kaluwagang loob sa biktima. Tutulan ang parusang bitay. Kung gusto mong tumulong para tutulan ang parusang pitay, sulatan o i-tweet o i-Facebook ang mga inyong kinatawan o senador at sabihin mo kung bakit kailangan tutulan ang parusang pitay. Sumali sa mga aktibidad na tutol sa parusang pitay. Mag-issue ng statement sa blog o social media laban sa parusang pitay. Tutulan ang parusang pitay.
Attorney Cathy? Okay. That presentation, no, a very well thought of and well prepared PowerPoint presentation from FLAG, no, and the Free Legal Assistance Group has been a partner and has been a strong advocate against the death penalty, and we've been working with them since 2005, no, when we were actually campaigning for the Philippines ratification to the optional protocol 2. So this is really a very good presentation and provides us justification that there's really no justification to reimpose the drug penalty in the Philippines. So to our panelists, what would you say about that presentation? Is it still true in the Philippines or in the world, in Indonesia, and in not only in as what Giada mentioned, in other countries? What do you think are the arguments, though? Are there really any arguments to reimpose the death penalty or to actually continue death penalty in countries mentioned earlier? Don't be shy. Please raise your hands. Okay, Ricky, thank you. Ricky?
Yeah, I'll just go first, kick off some these discussions. First, I completely understand that some people dislike or maybe have some hesitations around human rights arguments, whether that's like from the Western or whatever that is. Now, let's set aside the human rights argument, yeah, because maybe some people dislike that. I think one of the reasons why we have to oppose to the death penalty, because precisely the nature is irrevocable. We cannot undo the consequences of wrongful executions. If we wrongfully imprison people, we can set them free, give compensations, whatever it is. But if we wrongly kill people, there's no way we can revive that person back to life. And even if you give compensations to the families like millions of dollars, it won't give back because human matters above and beyond any like dollars, pesos, or any golds. Yeah, because it is so precious for our loved ones, for our family members, and so on. That's the first argument. The second argument, I would say, in terms of deterrence effect. Now, in the past decade or so, I've seen many people say, "Oh, that's useful for deter crimes." Now, I see two groups of offenders. First one is the rational one, meaning those who intentionally commit crimes. And then the second one is those who, under duress, coercion, manipulations, because of desperate of money and other reasons. The first one, the rational offenders. For rational offenders, of course, they will consider the costs and benefit of committing crimes. If there is a higher chance of them avoiding getting arrested and prosecuted and then convicted, they would still do the crimes anyway, whatever the sentence waiting for them, because they've calculated. And in the context of a country where your legal system is corrupted, like in Indonesia and many other places, there is no so-called perfect legal system. All countries are imperfect to different degrees. If the chances of avoiding prosecutions or convictions by bribing the law enforcement is much higher, much easier than getting caught and then sentenced to death, people will continue doing the crimes, regardless the sentence waiting for them. So there's no such thing as deterrence effect for rational offenders. Now, for the second group of offenders, if they are manipulated, if they are desperate for money, and then they have to say traffic drugs, I don't see death penalty is justified in this case, because they have some compelling reasons why they do it in the first hand. I've seen many people whose cases are fabricated. I've assisted one Kyrgyz girl from Kyrgyzstan, very poor, and never traveled internationally. So one day she was offered by her friend to come to Malaysia and then Indonesia for free. And of course, she accepted that offer, but she didn't know that she brought drugs inside her suitcase. I've assisted Mary Utami, Harm Reduction International, also helping with her clemency campaign now. She is a victim of domestic abuse. So she went to Taiwan to get a better life. And then she met some other guy and then went back to Indonesia. And then she met this guy again. And then that guy promised her that they would get married, have a happy life, go to Nepal for a holiday. And then one day she was asked by this guy to travel back to Indonesia while he had some other business back in Nepal. And she voluntarily came back to Indonesia without knowing that there were drugs inside the suitcase. And cases like this happen a lot across the region in Asia. And so in these kind of cases, I don't think we have some valid positions to warrant for death penalty. So I guess that's the additional two arguments.
Ate Rose, you're muted. What?
Giada, would you want to add anything?
Yeah, just quickly to put into context these excellent arguments that Ricky gave. We're talking here about drug offenses specifically. We're not talking about homicide, for example, when it comes to the Philippines. And as Ricky mentioned before, countries, especially countries in Asia and Southeast Asia, where the death penalty for drugs is mostly in place, have been the death penalty for drugs on their books for some 40 years now. And yet every year we see drug trafficking increasing. So if we want to give, a very simple but very clear evidence of why the death penalty doesn't work, is that if it did work, we would have seen it by now. So if the Philippines really is serious and committed to confronting drug trafficking, the death penalty is actually the wrong way to go. It's also worth mentioning that if the Philippines ends up reinstating the death penalty, it will actually go against its human rights obligation and its international drug control obligation. The consequence to that is that the Philippines will lose financial and technical assistance by international bodies to confront drug trafficking. So reintroducing the death penalty now is actually one of the worst things that the Philippines can do to combat drug trafficking and to confront drug syndicates. Another thing that I wanted to mention is that what Ricky was pointing at in terms of who's facing the death penalty for drugs is not by exception that a woman that has never traveled internationally ends up on death row. It's no exception that people are tricked or coerced into trafficking drugs. These are exactly the people that the death penalty is designed to target. We hear again and again in the discourse, both internationally and in the Philippines, that if we have the death penalty, then we will catch the drug lords, we will catch the drug kingpin, and all of a sudden there will be nobody to manage the drug market, and we will be free of drugs. That's just not, it will never be, and that's simply because those people who are visible to law enforcement, so people that will be stopped and searched, people that will be found with drugs, are people who carry drugs with them. And these are not the kingpins. These are the couriers or the mules. A drug kingpin will never cross a border with kilos of drug. A drug kingpin is the person that benefits economically from the crime. So if we put the death penalty in place, the only thing that we do is target those lower down in the drug hierarchy. We will put them in jail and we will not change anything, because there's always someone that's poor enough, that's desperate enough, or that's going to be tricked into carrying drugs. So yeah.
Thank you, Giada. I appreciate that point, especially since there are so many Filipinos all over the world who are actually on death row. And imposing the death penalty in the Philippines completely removes our government's capacity to negotiate for these Filipinos in other countries that are asking foreign governments to not impose the death penalty on them. But also, I'd like to ask Ricky again to say something.
Yeah, just to add on the drug lords and kingpin, since Giada mentioned it. The Kyrgyz woman that I mentioned earlier, she's a very poor woman, hardly speaks English, but she was portrayed by the Indonesian media as drug queen. I've assisted Lindsay Sandiford, British grandmother, who was tricked by the syndicate to traffic drugs from India via Thailand and then to Indonesia. And she was portrayed as the heroine queen by the media. So these whole narratives of drug kingpins, drug lords, drug queens, these are just gimmicks by the media. And don't let those in power fool us that the authorities arrest the right people. Like these are the top of the hierarchy of the syndicates. I mean, to be honest, if you're on top of the hierarchy, why would you travel, bring your drugs from one place to another place, and risking yourself to be arrested? And even if you get arrested, you could easily bribe the authorities. So this whole labels of drug lords, kingpins, are just for media hysteria to show that these are very like evil persons, individual trying to destroy the society, to ruin the fabric of society by labeling them, positions us to hate them even easier. But when we take a look into a closer to their case, these are very sympathetic case. People who are fooled, people who are desperate, people who just don't know anything that they are carrying drugs.
Thank you, Ricky. Thank you, Ricky. The point of who are disproportionately affected by the death penalty and generally punitive policies in drugs. It's really a good point, because as we can see, even in our jails in the Philippines, that the people who are detained for drug-related offenses are never really the ones that are the drug kings or queens, and it's always those who are desperate, too poor to do anything about their situation. So that's a really good point, as well as the point about media. I think it's also something for us advocates to take note of, that we need to also bring media to our side so they can they can tell a different story and not just sensationalize and justify what the government is doing with how it's implementing drug policies. And now I'd like to ask Lee to please share.
Yes, Kathy. I just wanted to add, no, um, if you look at the history of the Philippines in relation to death penalty, when we instituted when we had the death penalty before, the victims really, those who were convicted of death penalty, are the poor. Though we did not convict a rich person who is a drug lord, or who's a person who is capable of spurring the drug trade. That's just not true. Our own experience on the death penalty would already show that it's a punishment against the poor and not really targeting the drug lord. So that's the first thing I wanted to say. But the second thing I wanted to highlight also, if you look at the progression of our approach to drugs, so we've been investing in a lot of police. Uh, we've been building more prisons. We've been arresting more individuals in the past 3 years. If you look at the statistics, we have around close to 100,000 people incarcerated for drug-related offenses, and in fact, 30,000 people have already been killed in the war on drugs. So if you think about it, it's not really creating a harsher penalty framework that is going to address any contemplated drug related concern, no? What else do they want that is worse than people dying, no? But as we've often heard, the more targeted approach really is the certainty of punishment, and not creating harsher penalties in relation to any crime issues. So that's the second thing. But the last thing that I want to mention is that what's missing from this conversation so far from the proponents of death penalties, why are we so gung ho? Why are we so preoccupied with drug-related issues when we look at the statistics? Actually, the main premise that drug use is related to, say, violent crimes that is not established by global data. The latest report from the United Nations Office of Drugs and Crimes, it would show that a huge part, as much as 90% of people who use drugs, are not really related to any violent crimes. And even if you look at crimes related to substances, most of them are property crimes, really. And so, if you try to piece together all these discussions on drug lords and the issue on crime and security, it's just really a myth. If you think about it, it will just really be a war against the poor. It will not be a policy that will be targeted to drug-related issues, because it's not supported by evidence, and our history has already shown that it will just not work with the intended goal of targeting drug lords and the rich and the so-called individuals who are the target of the death penalty proposal.
Thank you, Lee. Those are very important points, and I just like to call attention to the dissonance between what the numbers are actually saying and how people who use drugs are portrayed in the media as well. There's always, whenever there's reporting about crime, regardless of whether this information is confirmed or verified, there's always a link in the headlines that the person who committed a very violent crime is did it because he or she was high on drugs. And then later on, there would be a follow-up news article that would say, oh, this person tested negative for drugs. So there's really a disconnect between the reality of connecting crime and violence to drug use versus how it's being shown to the general public. And I think it's also, again, very important. And going back to what Ricky was saying about how the media plays an important role in all of this. So before we go into the next part of our discussion, also all of these things that we mentioned, it leads us to ask, so what then? How then should we look at people who use drugs? How then should we treat people who use drugs? So before we go into that, I'd like to invite us to view this video from NoBox on harm reduction.
Pangarap ko, imposible. Basta makatapos yung dalawa. Masaya na ako, balis.
Kaya lang naman po ako gumamit ng ganyan kasi yung sa problema. Tsaka gusto ko nga rin po mag-aral. Dahil po sa magulang ko kasi lagi po akong pinapagalitan, ginugulpi, ganun.
May si presidente natin na pag walang sticker, ibig sabihin may addict dun sa isang bahay na yon. Kaya nung hindi kami nilagyan ng sticker, nagtataka yung pamilya ko. Kasi nga ako gumagamit. Kaya doon nalaman na gumagamit ako. Yun, nahuli kami. Nakulong kami. Wala sa aming ebidensya na na nakuha.
Yung term na tokhang, negative yung connotation, di ba? Pag tokhang, it means talagang papatahin ka pag nalaman na ikaw ay natokhang at ikaw ay gumamit or gumagamit ng illegal na droga. Kami rin naman bilang mga officials, naging tali din kami sa kung ano yung dapat naming sundin na naging mandato na rin namin dahil may kautusan. Kasi may kautusan na binded kami na sumunod or else kakasuhan po kami.
Ang lakas ng fear sa mga LGUs kahit they don't agree. Pero yung threat ng malagay sila sa narco list without due process, sabi ko nga, labanan ng values ngayon eh. At hindi na sa Pilipinas to. You can see it globally. Yung harm reduction na isa sa pag-defend ng values ng pakikipagkapwa, halimbawa, ng human rights. Then, kailangan pagpatuloy kahit mahirap.
Parang total paradigm shift na hindi nila kami tinuturoang mag-deviate nasa kung ano yung mandate namin as barangay officials. Yung integration na lang nito sa mga polisiya na umiiral tungkol sa usapin ng droga. Sana ma-appreciate nila at ma-apply din ng ating national government.
Ito yung grupo ng tambay, yung hindi ganong kinakausap. Nagkaroon sila ng organization in which tanggap sila kung sino sila, nakakapagsalita sila. Yung hindi ka ba mahihiming magsalita, parang na-uplift yung moral nila, parang gano'n.
Natural sa mga Pilipino na mapagkalinga tayo sa isa't isa. Yun yung kailangan na buhayin natin ulit sa issue na ito. Kailangan natin yung ganung values natin at culture and heart. Sila yung sentro. Tao yung sentro. It's not about the drugs, it's about the person.
Right, thank you. Before we fixing my camera. Okay, before we go to our discussion next, I'd like to just wrap up a little bit. So far we've discussed that as far as the experience of Indonesia and other countries in the world have shown that the death penalty doesn't really work. It doesn't really stop people from committing crimes in the first place. But another question I'd like to raise is, should drug drug-related concerns, should drug use be even considered a crime at all? And so with this thought in mind, we have a question from the public health approach to drugs.
Attorney Kathy, you're on mute. Hello? Maybe.
Yes, sorry, Inez.
I lost you, Kat, with the question.
Sorry, okay, I'll repeat very quickly. So we have a question from one of our audience asking, what's the public health approach to drugs? What's harm reduction? And is it going to stop or is it going to solve the drug problem?
Oh, okay. Sige. Siguro, it would be good to start. Something that that was mentioned kanina, I think that was by Lee. Siguro we have to step back muna and look at the whole idea of drug use and understanding that drug use in itself is not a problem. And I think that's where one of the challenges have been. Kasi automatic, for a lot of people, they think just because drug use is in the picture and just because somebody is using drugs, then therefore there's something wrong already with the person. So I think we have to get that out from our minds, because that whole idea where a person who's using drugs needs to be fixed or is broken or else is the same kind of thinking and rationale where you force people into treatment, you surprise them with drug testing because you want to catch them. And actually, it's the same rationale and thinking that's fueling all the killings, because you're saying, be fixed or else. So given that now, then you say, well, then among the evidence shows that if you go by the UNODC World Drug Report, where you have about 87% of people who are using drugs are non-problematic, no substance use disorder, not causing harm to self or others. So you can say if among 100, I always say this, among 100 people, for example, who are using drugs, and you're saying only 13%, 87% non-problematic, and you have 13% who may be experiencing a problematic situation where drugs may be involved or may be present, then I think it's very clear that drugs is not the problem. So I think the very first thing we need to do here is in addressing situations about drugs is to actually defocus from drugs, set it aside for a minute, and then look at the person. We're so hung up on drugs that we forget there's a person involved. So if that person now you've taken all this scapegoating about drugs, then you can now really look into the situation and really understand what's going on, for example, with this person, diba? And I think harm reduction gives us a framework, provides this framework for really understanding what the problem is that we are trying to resolve, right? So a lot of this noise and talk, I really think it's a lot of noise, is that it's because these people are coming up with solutions without really trying to understand what the problem is that we're trying to address. And worse, these policies, restrictive policies, have actually created more harm, placed people in more harm, so they've contributed not to the problem that they're trying to resolve. So parang, so that said, with the framework, you're looking at the idea that yes, drugs are involved, but who is using it and how are they using it? I mean, the idea is about health, safety, well-being, right? So we already know this. People are using drugs for a variety of reasons. And so we need to understand this range of realities. Here in the Philippines, we already recognize that. And it's great because there had been no conversation beyond 4 years ago about drugs. But now we're understanding people are using because it helps them work longer hours. A lot of the people are involved in the informal economy. Um, um, you take shabu, you don't go hungry, you don't have to eat. Diba? So there are ways to understand what would be helpful to the person. I think also there's also implications here for, sorry, I said pala drugs, who's using it, and also the context in which they're using it. So by doing that, we are able to identify now where are the risks coming from? Where are the problems coming from? And if we're able to understand that, then we can say, this is pala what we should be doing. No? Why are they not? They're not coming for treatment. They're not coming to the community-based program. And then there's a tendency to say, to point fingers at them, but maybe it is difficult for them to go to the program, diba? They will be exposed. They have friends who had benefit of the doubt. They went to these programs and they end up dead. No, they need to pay for pamasahe, for the fare, just to go there and then lose the income for the day. So there are so many things going on, and I think that's what we need to do. So understand the world that the person is walking around in, and then we would be able to better respond. Ano yung services kailangan? Is it if there are mental health concerns, for example, then that's something. This has even implications about drug education. So when you speak of the harm reduction framework, and now you have a more nuanced, realistic understanding about drugs. So now we have to reflect that in our drug education. Kasi we said nga 87% people are non-problematic. But drug use is an activity like anything. It has its functions, it may have its risks. But if we just limit drugs are bad without really wala, di ba? So people don't know how to keep safe. So drug education, which we've been trying to do, no, hindi lang siya drug propaganda dapat. Really understanding the intersect of the drugs itself, the predictable effects, who's using it, how it's affecting them, how the context is affecting them. So yeah, in that sense, there's really a lot already actually that we can do. I think siguro yung key lang is that again. When we say a treatment, it sounds so nice and benign. But if our focus is drugs and being drug-free, then problem na siya kaagad. Because what's happening is a lot of the actions are geared towards making that person stop no matter what. So I think we should really defocus from that and focus on what kind of support would a person need, for example, who might be in a problematic situation. And for those who are not problematic and functioning, drugs is a non-issue until society and policy and legislation decides to make it an issue. So yun, siguro for now.
Thank you, Inez. I think those are very, very important points. And for some who are listening to us or watching us, these might be very new ideas, but actually they're not contradictory to what government is saying that they want to do about drugs. That is to protect the health and safety of our people. And so it's a bit, there's clearly a disconnect again between what the policy is supposed to, what the goal of the policy is supposed to be, which is to protect the health and safety of the people, and yet the policies themselves are the ones that are causing all of this harm by arresting people and bringing them into detention where the situation is, in fact, makes their health and their well-being very much unsafe. But before I proceed to the next question, Lee wanted to say something. Go ahead, Lee.
Yeah, I just wanted to add some more figures. No, we were saying about how there's really a preoccupation on the substance, the use of the substance. But if you look at the data we have right now, 1 in 18 adults would have used substance within the past year. No, it's very common. It's very prevalent. And not just the scheduled substance. No, when you think about the culture of drinking alcohol, it's a psychoactive substance, and it's very similar in terms of its physiologic effect to other psychoactive substances that we have. And in fact, there are some data which would link alcohol consumption with other domestic crimes. But we don't treat alcohol consumption with the same ferocity as we have with other psychoactive substance. And if you think about it, the reason why it's arbitrary is because the focus is on the substance, use or not use, right? What we want from a harm reduction perspective is to change that. We shouldn't be focusing on the substance, whether people are using or not using, but we should, from a substance-centric perspective, we shift towards a people-centric perspective. We look at the person and what are the actual and real issues that are relevant to the person, and that's where we give support. When we conducted our community initiatives, when we conducted our ethnographic study, and when we talk to people who use drugs, the actual relevant issues for them is actually either economic in nature. They would want some productive livelihood so that they would be engaged in selling drugs, or the actual use of methamphetamine, for example, is related to hard labor. And so naturally, if they see, if they engage in some other alternative livelihood, which would not require them to take methamphetamine or stimulants so that they could work longer hours, then naturally they could end, if they want to, they could not use drugs anymore. So that's what we say when we look at a public health approach or a people-centered approach. We look at the human person and address the real issues that are relevant to them. If it's related to peer or social interactions, then our policies are more responsive. But the problem is when you just frame it as a criminal issue, then all these conversations stop. We stop understanding that a person has economic, social, and health concerns. What we're just concerned about is that they should stop using drugs, or else we'll put them into prison, or maybe other more punitive policies that we have. No, so I think there should be a conversation on this, and the conversation should be broader than just saying should people use drugs or not use drugs. It should be broader than that, and that's harm reduction. I think it's opening up honest conversation so that we become more sensitive to the lived realities in our communities, and that's what we've experienced with dealing with communities with where drugs are as an important issue.
Thank you, Lee. Which leads me to the next question. So proponents of the death penalty are saying that it's the only way to stop drug lords. And so the question that's been on a lot of people's minds is, okay, if we want to deal with people who use drugs with a public health approach, but how do we deal with those who are selling drugs? So that's something that I'd like to ask you to weigh in on. Who would like to volunteer first? Can I ask Ricky looks? Sorry, Giada Giada just raised her hand. So Giada, please share.
Yeah, so thanks, Kathy. And I think the way to start answering that question is just to go back to those amazing points that Inez made before that seemed very basic but stand at the core of our whole conversation today. The first point is that people who use drugs are people, and drug use is something that whether we like to admit it or not is just natural and inevitable. And the second point is precisely that one. Drug use is inevitable, and there's no way to stop this because there's no need to stop it. If we look at our own lives, we realize that all of us use some kind of substance or undertake an activity that allow us to deal with the reality of our own life. And these 2 points allow us to also answer the question of how we should approach people who sell drugs. So first, people who sell drugs are people. They're people with a life, with a dignity, with a life history, with experience, and who live in a context. And the second point is that if drug use is inevitable, then it's inevitable that someone will be there to, offer the substances to those who need them or want them. The only difference here is that because we are living in a context where some substances are prohibited, then some substances cannot be purchased in a shop or in pharmacy as we do with other substances, but we have to rely on an underground market. So what we really need to ask ourselves is why do some people sell those kind of drugs? Why we should look at the reasons that lead some people to that specific line of work. Why are they not, for example, jeepney drivers or office workers, but they decided to enter that specific line of work? It could be a choice. It could be a choice that's dictated by poverty or by other life experiences, or it could not be a choice. If we go back to the death penalty, as Ricky was mentioning, we see so many times people that are either forced or tricked or exploited or convinced because of vulnerability to carry drugs. Even when it's a choice, those are the cases that are more clear-cut. But then even when it's a choice, we should look very closely at the pathways towards that choice. So those underlying social, legal, cultural, and economic determinants that drove a person to, let's say, find employment in an underground market rather than in the legal market. And again, if we want to somehow reduce the number of people who sell drugs, the way to do so is not to put them in jail or in prison. The only thing that putting them in prison will do is to further reduce their opportunities in life. And the way to stop them is not to kill them. It's rather, as Inez was saying, to really look at the person, at the experience of the person, at its many identities, and at those social and economic determinants, and then ensure that everyone has the opportunities in life that they deserve so that they can make an informed choice about what they want to do with their life. Now, the problem is that we have all been raised within a prohibitionist approach to drugs. We have all been educated to think that drugs are bad and that a person that is anyways involved with drugs because he produces them, he uses them, he sells them, is by default not a human anymore, is a criminal, it's a second-class citizen, is someone that's not as human as us, and so it deserves to be treated as a criminal and as lesser. So what we really need to do here is like de-educate ourselves and really rethink, rethink the way we see drug use so that we can have more of an evidence-based look at it and approach the issue as it actually is. Thanks.
Thank you, Giada. Can I ask Ricky to add his comments, please? Thank you, Giada.
Yeah, thank you, Kathy. It's not that I don't want to answer this question, but as Giada has thoroughly explained, it suggests that it's a very complex questions to answer only just in a few minutes. But let me give you some points. First, when we say selling drugs, which drugs are we talking about? Be it cannabis, methamphetamine, heroin, or any other kind of drugs. Because each drugs has different effects. Even like cannabis could be, even if it's like no effect, it could be have some little effect to someone, but no effect to the other person. Second, there is a wide range of policies or quote-unquote regulations on how we deal with drugs. From the one end extreme is the complete prohibition that we have now in many countries, including in the region, Indonesia and the Philippines. Complete prohibitions where we criminalize all activities related with drugs, from planting, possessions, buying, selling, production, exporting, importing, and consumption. And then the other end is like a supermarket, like a candy. You can buy and you can consume freely. Yeah, but Kathy likes to go to 7-Eleven, so it's like selling drugs in 7-Eleven. It's just for free. Now in the middle we have decriminalizations, which means we could decriminalize drug use. So if someone use drugs for personal consumption, they could be they don't need to be criminalized. Maybe they could be in contact with the police, and then once the police know, oh, that's for personal consumption, the police might divert them to treatment if it's needed. But even if drug use is decriminalized, it does not necessarily mean drug selling is decriminalized. Government could still criminalize selling, and in many other countries this is also happening. And then there is a policy called regulations, where government regulate drugs, maybe like alcohol or tobacco, and that relates with again the amount of drugs that they sell, the places, whether it's licensed, and then methods of consumption. For alcohol, it's pretty much easy, like you drink it, like. But for drugs, there are many methods of consumption, from injecting, smoking, and many other things. And then also, how do you buy or how do you get drugs, whether prescriptions or certain for certain amount you could buy for free. And again, it depends on which drugs. So how do we deal with those who sell? It depends on the policy that the governments or the public want to make. But underlying is that we need to have open and honest discussions around drugs and drug policy, because we've been in many decades now, we've been told a lot of lies of drugs, that it makes us dizzy, kill us, blah blah blah. I mean, in Indonesia, cannabis is classified as the first class of drugs, along with heroin. Meanwhile, tobacco is regulated. But again, I guess fundamentally, it's all about what do we want to regulate about drugs. And again, just echo other speakers that drugs, first and foremost, is a health issue. And so there's no urgency or justification to treat that as a criminal matters, because we've seen in many other countries that criminalizations or death penalty does not work to treat drug problems. Meanwhile, harm reductions, we have the evidence that it works, and it's helpful for those who need the treatment.
Thank you, Ricky. Those are very important points, and I really believe that I don't think the people who came up with our drug laws in the Philippines have ever even sat down to talk about these things. Because if you look at the way our law is written, it's really just a list of all the things that you're not supposed to do and what's going to happen to you if you break these laws. Sorry. So I think it's important that we can't be lazy about coming up with the policy and send them all to jail. I think the way our government is doing it now, it's just a shortcut method. It's like they don't want to deal with this issue at all. So let's just send everyone to jail. And so as a result, what's happening is thousands of people and thousands of families are suffering. And if we are just able to come out with an honest discussion with policymakers, and for them to admit that I don't really understand what drugs are and how they work, I think it would make a lot of changes in how our policies are also made. I'm sorry, my video keeps cutting out because the internet connection is so bad. But I'd like to ask Lee to share his views. Lee, please go ahead.
Hello, Kathy.
Yes, go ahead, Lee. Sorry, my video is so bad.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, since 2016, when the Philippines embarked on the war on drugs, we actually incarcerated more people who use drugs or who sell drugs. Right now, if you look at our jail and prison population, as much as 71% of our people in jails and in prison, they are related to selling drugs or using drugs. And this is a staggering figure, because if you look at our jails, around 500% congested, overly congested. In fact, in the latest United Nations Human Rights Committee report, we are one of the most congested, if not the most congested, in terms of jail population all over the world. And this is largely because of our preoccupation with drug prohibition, with our solution to issues related to selling drugs or using drugs is to put more people in prison. And this actually is a contradiction. If you think about it, we've been putting more people in jail and in prison, but the issue of selling drugs and using drugs, that has not changed and that has not been solved. So the question right now is, what should be the proper policy approach? If in the past the policy lens that's being used by our legislators and by our policymakers is always through the lens of criminal law, using the tools of jails, prisons, using the police, I think it's but high time right now that we change the way we see things and try to realize that it's not really an issue that is proper within the penal system, but it's more of a social and economic issue that we should address. There's also what we call, if you look at the broad meaning of harm reduction, that includes economic and social responses for drug-related issues. And as mentioned by Ricky a while ago, there are diversion systems for that. No, so for people who are using or even selling drugs, instead of putting them in prison, you divert them to more community resources. And that's actually one of the calls from the civil society, is to recognize that the evidence-based solution for drug-related issues is not building more prisons or incarcerating more people, but it's really addressing the root cause, the economic and social issues surrounding selling and using drugs. And in practical terms, that will actually translate to more livelihood support, that will translate to more community support, that will translate to more the human development indices that's really investing more in in persons and in communities than just merely putting people in prison. And I think that's the proper approach that we should take when we look at the issues of using drugs or selling drugs.
Thank you, Lee. This has been a really awesome discussion, but we have to invite you to come up with your closing messages. But while you prepare, I'd like to read some of the comments that we received from our audience. So from Jenny Linares, let us continue to have discussions like this to humanize those that have been the target of inhumane policies. Sorry.
Yes, hello. Attorney Patty? Okay. There is an additional question. I don't know anyone who wants to respond on this. Is there any, of course, it's for Inez and Lee. Is there any update on proposed amendments to the dangerous drugs law? Is public health approach already being considered in the amendments of the law? Or is DOH and PDEA applying this approach? Inez or Lee?
Sige, Lee, go ahead. I'll jump in later.
Parang it's a complex question.
Ang dami.
Rose, It's a very complex question. But I'll try to maybe break it down. So the first part is in relation to are there policy deliberations to change the way we're approaching drugs? There are some progressive bills, the bills that you've seen, filed in the Senate and in the Congress. And in the past, there have been some deliberations also on the harm reduction, introducing harm reduction or public health approaches. Because I agree that this would need a legislative overhaul of our drug policy. It will not be enough for us to talk to the Department of Health or PDEA, because our very drug law regime is very punitive. And so we need to amend RA 9165. So there are efforts there, and I think we need to support. And hopefully these are the actual discussions in Congress, as opposed to discussing the merits of death penalty or like should we kill people. I think the more relevant discussion is to look at the public health approach and the harm reduction as a means to address drug-related issues. So that's one. In relation to the present approach of the government, you see some initiatives also from health agencies, but I think it's very not comprehensive, and I think it's really medicalized. When I say it's medicalized, as opposed to using prison, the key intervention is treatment, and treatment in mega rehabilitation centers. Medicalizing drug use and putting people in prison, they're actually policies of the same, how do you say it? They're the same, they're coming from the same spirit, no? From the same perspective. They're actually just either putting people in prison or putting people compulsorily in treatment centers or forcing treatment. And they're both focusing on the premise that drug use is automatically a bad thing, and we should correct it. That people who use drugs are addicts, that they are dependent, or they have disorder or personality disorders or substance use disorders. So both of them are actually coming from a wrong premise, and a fundamental premise at that. So I think in general, that's the same perspective that we can see in government, in even in health agencies. And for us to be really evidence-based and scientific, I think we should veer away from a medicalized approach or a punitive approach. And the approach really is harm reduction, the comprehensive public health approach to drugs.
Rose, mute.
Inez, you want to add more? Sorry.
No, we pretty much covered it. I mean, the existing, I mean, it's when we speak about making amendments to the 9165, like you say, it's easier to tear down a house and just build a really new one and a good one rather than renovating kasi mahirap. And we've actually looked at the 9165. If the basic framework is already punitive, diba? It's so difficult. It's crazy. So I think it's better to look at, it's so focused now on being drug-free. So I think we should focus on more what are the support systems that we need to put in place, for example. It's so confused now. Because like, even if you look at 9165, there was an attempt because treatment was transferred, for example, from the law enforcement, before it was PNP, and so on and so forth, and then PNP, NBI, and now it's DOH. But then it's still the language. It's still about court orders. It's still about penalty. It's still about saying, okay, 6 months, who's to say? We're talking about range of realities. I mean, you cannot dictate how long or what a person needs through legislation. So, siguro yun, and the focus of quality of life. So, what Lee was saying, you're looking at social concerns, economic, and so on and so forth. So, dapat all of that would be inputted into it. There's some attempt, because people talk about quality of life as measures, pero, sorry, it's funny, but it shouldn't be. But then they do drug testing, and then they're positive. It erases everything. So, parang, you just negated everything else. So you really do not believe in quality of life. So bring it back in, make it the primary. So if a person's using drugs, but you have all these things in place, I think that would be make for a better policy and law. And the other thing also, I think legislators sana like to be informed, because one of the hearings, for example, I was listening to, you actually have legislators saying they're so confused because of all the terms and everything. So nako, paano yan? So yun. So I said I go on and on, but yeah, basically let's just take it away and just build a really nice new home. Thank you.
Salamat. Attorney Cathy, in ka na po.
Yes po, yes. I'm back. Pasensya na po, ang daming, my internet connection is as frustrating as our drug policies in the Philippines. Anyways, I don't know if you were able to read all of the comments, but we had some comments from our viewers. One of them is that from Gloria Lay. She said that racism is alive and kicking in Asia. It intersects with brutality in the criminal justice system and law and extends even to the application of death penalty as seen in the case of Indonesia. And so this racism is another reason to abolish death penalty. And since we have only a few minutes left, I'd like to invite our our panelists who've shared a lot of very good insights, a lot of thought-provoking statements. And I'm sure those of us who are listening to this, I hope this has got a lot of people rethinking their view about drugs and people who use drugs. But I'd like to ask everyone now to share their closing messages before we end our discussion today. So since Ines was the last person who shared, should be I'll ask her to share last. Can I ask Giada to please share your closing message?
Sure. I mean, I don't really have a closing message. I just want to thank the organizers, to thank NoBox, StreetLawPH, PANA, and all the NGOs, the civil society groups, the human rights defenders who are fighting in the Philippines for more humane drug policies and criminal legal systems. I think the government of the Philippines, as other populist governments, is very smart and very intentional in weaponizing drugs and creating that noise that that Inez was referring to before. It's not by mistake or because they're ignorant or because they haven't thought about it. They're very, very intentional in scapegoating drugs as the issue in the Philippines so that they can shy away from the other problems that the Philippines is facing now. Poverty, for example, is one of them. So, and you see, like the fact that we are now in the middle of a global pandemic, prison overcrowding is the worst in the world, and Duterte keeps every time he gets airtime, basically, to encourage people to kill its own fellow citizens because they're suspecting of using drugs. The fact that he keeps pushing for the death penalty, which we all know and he knows as well, is a useless, costly measure. I think it makes its approach and its strategy and the strategy of its government very, very, very clear. The government relies on the public staying ignorant. It relies on the public not knowing evidence, not thinking about drug policy in a different way so that, it can keep pursuing its policies without anyone critically assessing it. So I know it's very hard to operate in this context, but I believe that what we have been doing today, so keep talking about it, keep presenting the evidence, keep talking about the opportunities and the alternatives is what can really change the situation. And I'm sure the situation will change at some point. So thanks again, and let's keep working, towards a better drug policy in the Philippines.
Thank you, Giada. But before I call on the other participants, may I also ask you, is there any activity lined up for October 10? This is the World Day Against Death Penalty?
Yeah, so the 10th of October is the World Day Against the Death Penalty. And this year the topic will be legal assistance, so effective legal assistance. I'm not sure exactly what will happen in the Philippines, but there are NGOs and groups such as FLAG and NoBox who have always been very active in organizing panels and organizing activities around the day. So what I would do is to encourage you to just go on their website, on their Facebook, on their Twitter pages and see what's happening. The World Coalition Against the Death Penalty is the world organization that coordinates the Day Against the Death Penalty. So I'm sure they will also have more information.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Giada. Can I ask Ricky to share next?
Thank you, Kathy. Let me start with Philippines. Is one of very few countries in Southeast Asia that currently doesn't have the death penalty, and so it places the Philippines as a champion on the right to life. Because in the region, many other countries have the death penalty. I think only Philippines and Cambodia that don't have the death penalty, and the other one is Timor-Leste. And I would strongly support any movement to block any effort to reinstate the death penalty, bring back to the Philippines, because my worry is that there's some slight development in Indonesia. There's some small steps in Malaysia, small steps in Thailand, and I don't want to see Philippines roll back and reinstate the death penalty. I hope because if they reinstate the death penalty, it might have some effect, negative effect to other countries in the region. So I would strongly support your effort to block any move to reintroduce the death penalty in the Philippines. Secondly, I highly value the work of NoBox, Para, iDEFEND, and many other human rights organizations in the Philippines, and lawyers like you, Kathy, and other individuals and organizations joining forces to advocate for a better drug policy in the Philippines. It's not a easy problem. It's always highly controversial. We've been living in a society where drugs are always seen as evil for many decades. So it's always difficult to counter that narrative. And so your work has been instrumental and very critical during this period, and I remain supportive of your movement. And let's keep the discussions move, and hopefully Philippines will be achieving much better condition towards its drug policy. Thank you.
Thank you, Ricky. What you said is it's very true. When I was in university, it was such a big deal for us students that the Philippines was one of the few countries where death penalty was no longer enforced, and it felt like such a big achievement for the country to be able to do this. And in fact, the Philippines is a signatory to international convention uh, prohibiting the death penalty, and so going back into this situation would not only uh, push us back into really questionable policies, but also makes us violate our own the conventions that we are signatories to. So there's really a lot of consequences, and I'm hoping that the government will rethink its position on this situation. And I'd also like to thank LBH Masyarakat because we are receiving a lot of inspiration from the work that you are doing in Indonesia, and it's one of the organizations that we at StreetLawPH really look up to very much. And while the situation here is it's quite difficult to provide direct legal services and human rights protection, but we look to you and other organizations like HRI for hope and support, and we're very thankful that you are there. Your being in this environment also keeps us going. So thank you for that. That made me laugh. And yes, I miss going to 7-Eleven with you guys. So can I ask Lee, please share?
Hi, Kathy. Thank you very much. Thank you, Giada. Thank you, Ricky. Uh, as a parting message, I'd invite the audience to reflect and reimagine drug policy. Maybe after this talk, try to reimagine it. What would be your solution or what would be your approach when you know someone who's using drugs? Could either be your neighbor, someone who you work with, someone who's a relative, your sibling or your parent. Would your approach be? And I think it's not hard to reflect on that and translate that into a national drug policy. You know? Our reaction would be from a place of support, from a place of understanding. We want to evaluate what are the actual issues surrounding that person we know. And I think that's a good place to start when we start our discussion on drug policy reform. For centuries already, we've seen how drug prohibition not only has failed with its goal of a drug-free society, but it has actually created more harms than its intended goal. It has failed drastically and created more injuries to our communities and to our families and to the Philippines in general. And I think death penalty is just but another tool of the drug prohibition, which we should not embrace and we should not accept, and we should fight with all the vigor that we can have as a community of human rights advocates. we should fight against a policy that's not just inhumane and degrading, but is actually a very violation of the right to life itself. Well, at this point, I just want to thank Giada and Ricky and Kathy and Rose and Inez for this wonderful afternoon. And for our audience, maybe this would be an important opportunity for you to revisit and reflect on how you do reimagine your approach to drugs and your understanding of drugs in general. Thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you, Lee. We appreciate so much your sharing. And we're very fortunate that in the movement for harm reduction and humane drug policies, we have you on our side. I feel like we have someone who is really important in this fight because you know what you're talking about, and we're lucky to have you. Thank you, Lee. Now, can I ask Inez to please share?
Hi, yeah. So thank you, and thank you again, everyone, to all the speakers who shared all their insights and experience and all. So really, if anything, it's more of we talk about, is drugs a criminal issue? Is it a health issue? Maybe we need to think, well, recognize that it's a human issue, and to bring it back to the person again, and the value and power of the human connection and relationships. We're too hung up on programs and stuff, and we forget the person in the middle. And I would like to say as well that there are attempts naman. I mean, to shout out to the good souls who are now working in government who are really trying. But in putting forth changes, for example, we need again to have that nuance and honest understanding about drugs. That's very, very key and important. And understanding that drugs is not the problem. Okay. So that said, for example, when you talk about now the government has the PADS, Philippine Anti-Illegal Drugs Strategy. So maybe we need to move the S to the other side. And taking from what Sanhotri was saying, that maybe we need to strategize to stop poverty, alienation, and despair. And maybe that's what we need to focus on as well. So siguro yon lang, and siguro just leaving with a quote that I really love and I want to share it, and maybe to all people in position and power and to the legislators who are deliberating on this, and that do not let the roles you play in life make you forget that you are human. Because at the end of the day, it's never been about the drugs, it's always about the person. So thank you.
Maraming salamat, Inez. Thank you, Ricky, Inez, Lee, and Giada. I'm also very thankful to be part of this discussion. There's so many things going on. We're in the middle of a pandemic, and yet people are still being killed. There's still a lot of killings that's happening. There was a document saying that as of at the end of July this year, we had 53 drug-related killings already. And yet, despite this terrible situation, it seems that the policy of the government, instead of looking for solutions for our very important health issues, it seems like the priority is really to come out with policies that don't really respond to the problems that we have now. I hope this discussion that we have is just a start of many, and we hope that those who are listening can also start their own discussions, talk about this issue, because we really need to talk about these things more often, so that it becomes a normal part of the narrative here in the Philippines, that drugs are no longer taboo to be discussed, and it's something that we also have to overcome as a society. But let me pass you on to Rose, Ate Rose, for your closing remarks for Para. Ate Rose? Mag-video na po ba diretso or
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, go po.
I'm very sorry. I did not notice my computer battery is drained. Well, is it my time to say goodbye?
Yes po.
How
Yes
about
po.
your last words, Attorney Kathy?
Akala ko yun na yun. Sige po. Balikan ko lang. I just like to go back that there's a disconnect between what's happening in real life in our communities with people who use drugs, with how the law treats people who use drugs. So there's a clearly a need to push for humane laws and to repeal the existing law that we have. So for me, the next challenge for us at Street Law is to push for the end of criminalization of drug use and possession for personal use. And I hope we have the support of the other organizations who are here with us today. Thank you.
Okay, maraming salamat po, and we are really very grateful to, especially to Giada and Ricky, who joined us this afternoon, despite especially for Giada, despite the time difference. Very grateful with NoBox, our experts on drug concerns and human rights, and of course to Attorney Cathy, who has been with us, a human rights lawyer, no? For so many long years, but of course I'm older than Cathy, but I have known her for years now. Maraming salamat po. No? This issue on drugs and death penalty is worldwide, but majority of the countries are moving towards abolitionist stand and a public health approach to the drug concerns. And we hope that the Philippines will not go back to a retrogressive approach, a punitive approach on the issues of drugs or whatever crime is it, death penalty is not the answer. We are very thankful to the regional and international groups who are in solidarity with the Philippines, especially now that there is the threat, for the reimposition of a death penalty in the Philippines. And we hope that you will continue to support our struggle against the death penalty. And for PARA and iDEFEND, we will continue to discuss human rights issues, not only on death penalty, but many of the repressive laws that we have now in the Philippines. And we will continue to be in solidarity with human rights defenders in the region and worldwide. So we will be closing now with our favorite video, and this is a call to all of us. Lumabas tayo, lumaban tayo.
$191 people have lost their lives.
COVID-19 is spreading.
Department of Health reported 9 new confirmed cases. Patients 25.
Measures na pinapatupad ngayon gaya ng social distancing.
Na wala pa silang natatanggap na ayuda mula sa pamahalaan bilang pagsunod sa isinasaad sa enhanced community.
Ng mga inaasikasong COVID-19 patients, maraming doktor ang hindi na po nakakauwi.
To take urgent and aggressive action.
Lumabas tayo.
Lumabas tayo sa makitid na pananaw, papunta sa malawak na pag-unawa sa isa't isa, lalo para sa mga taong naisasantabi at kailangan pakinggan.
Lumabas tayo mula sa mga kanya-kanyang pag-aalala, lampas sa sari-sariling pangamba, dahil ang kailangang harapin ay sinusubok tayong magkakasama.
Lumabas tayo mula sa pananahimik, dahil ngayong ang buhay natin ang nakataya, ay hindi dapat pipi at nakapikit, napapastulin nila tunong bangin.
Lumabas tayo mula sa dilim ng panlilinlang at panlilito. Malinaw sa atin kung ano ang gusto nating masalubong sa paglabas natin ngayon papuntang bukas.
Kabuhayan na sasapat, pagkain na busog,
tahanan
na kakanlong, malayang umalam, kumilos, makialam.
Unahin ang kapakanan ng mamamayan, kilalanin ang karapatan.
Lalabas tayo sa kabanatang ito sa buhay natin. Baon ng katotohanang may mas malalaki pa tayong mapagwawagian.
Na hindi na tayo papayag maipasok muli sa ganitong hirap na kalagayan dahil matutut tayong lumaban sa iba pang mga sakit ng lipunan.
Lumabas tayo. Lumaban tayo.